Hey guys, so this is going to be the third video for Assignment 5, and in this one we're going to talk all about implementing a gameplay HUD. Super important element in any game, of course, right? Usually comes in later, but usually starts with kind of a debug elements on the screen, kind of like we did with our little debug text earlier on in the course. But super important, it's there to show all the required gameplay information to the player, and there's a lot of schools of thought on how to design the UI. What do you want to show? Do you want to have things be context sensitive where they pop up at particular times? Especially in games like RPGs, HUDs can become very kind of cumbersome and overbearing. So it's a whole thing, right? Like there are people who are user experience UI designers, UX UI, and that's their entire job, is just to design the menu flow and the gameplay HUD and stuff for the game, because it's an extremely important piece of the puzzle, similar to audio, right? It is a visual aspect of your game. It's what gives your player all the information that they need to know to play your game. So it's something that's worth putting a decent amount of thought into, right? How do you want to organize things, etc. We're obviously going to talk about it from an implementation standpoint, but you guys can do whatever you like with your HUD, and I'll kind of show you here in a minute what I'm talking about. But we're going to use another new system in Unity, similar to what we did with audio, right? We're going to kind of talk about it as we implement here, and it's called the Canvas UI system. And it's a way for you to set up a UI right in the hierarchy in Unity and use sprites and text in the form of a Text Mesh Pro component to build out your HUD, and then you can access those components in script to update them, right? If you have text for score or something, you can access that specific text element, similar to how we do everything else in Unity, right? You can just drag it in and then update that text element to say whatever you want. And of course, there's a lot of nuance. The Canvas system is very complex, so you'll be looking at it in later courses as well, and we're just going to kind of do an introduction to it. So yeah, we're going to look at the Canvas system. We're going to be looking at doing our HUD and what information we're going to be displaying there. And there are a few art assets associated with this. And then once we've got that finished, we'll do a final video where we do our main menu screen and our game over screen. So before we get started here, let's just talk about the art assets that you are going to require for this part of the assignment. Now, like I talked about with you guys previously, I do have placeholder assets for you. So let's just take a look at those now, and we'll kind of talk about what you need to create as well. So in the Assignment 5 folder on Brightspace, you can download this zip, which includes all of my art assets. You will need to replace these with your own, but I just want to show you exactly what we're going to be doing here. So we are going to, let's take a look at the finished version here so we can see how it works. So we start up the game. I'm going to turn my volume down at this point. And we start with a main menu here, right? And that is built, again, using this Canvas UI system. You can actually see it here in the hierarchy. You can see we have a HUD, main menu, and an end game screen. And right now we just have the main menu turned on. And it's built out of a background image and a button, which is a UI element, and a title, Space Warrior here. So we're going to need a couple things to build this out, right? We're going to need a background image, and we're going to need a font that is specific to your game. Pretty simple, right? And then once we get into the game, we have this HUD here that is built out of several components. So it is just a singular image. So if we look back at the user interface assets here, right, there's our menu background, right? It doesn't have any text on it. We're going to add that in Unity, right? That's going to be from a custom font that you'll pick, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in terms of the art assets that you need for this HUD, we have the actual background bar that makes up the HUD, and then we have a little thing to show a life, right? It's like a Mario head, basically. So those are the only two elements that you need, and the rest we're going to display as text, which we're going to display in your custom font, right? But the idea is that, just like the main menu, this HUD is built out of multiple pieces, right? So for example, each of these life bars are a separate sprite here, right? And there's even a fourth one in here for some reason, I guess in case you want to have 4 lives. And then the time is a text element that we update via script, and it's in our custom font. Same thing with our score. right? So we have a score title here, which doesn't change, and then we have a text element here that's 0 right now. That, of course, you know, would change along with our score. I don't think I can actually change anything because the game is like updating these things every frame here, so it won't actually let me change it. But you can see how it's built out. And the other thing that I want you guys to keep in mind here is that this stuff can go anywhere. Because these things are all separate objects, you don't have to have your HUD cover this entire, you know, bottom portion of your screen, right? Like if you wanted to, for whatever reason, you could have your lives over in the corner, and you could have your score over in this corner, and you could have your time limit, I don't know, like maybe, well, it could just be in the middle. I wouldn't put anything at the bottom where your player is, because that wouldn't be ideal, obviously. So you can move all these elements. It doesn't matter where they are. So your art asset that you create for the HUD background, just make sure you create something that's going to work, right? If you want to have 2 different HUD pieces, one for either side of the screen and then one for the middle, that's totally fine. I just wanted to demonstrate how easy it is to move this stuff around, and it's the same thing with your main menu and your game over screen. You can have those elements anywhere you want, so just keep that in mind while you're thinking about how you want to do your HUD. Completely up to you how you want to do it. If you want to do stuff in the bottom hand corners here, whatever. But I am going to do mine all along a bar at the top of the screen like this, okay? But once it's set up, it's very easy to move the stuff around and stuff. The Canvas system is very slick, in my opinion, right? And then we just turn on and off whatever we need, right? There we got the main menu there. Turn that on whenever we need it, and same thing with the endgame menu, right? And that's how it's going to work. So those are your art assets, and let's just briefly talk about the font in particular, right? Like I said, I would like you guys to create the art asset for your HUD background and for your little life. Now, it can just be your player colored. But the menu background, you don't have to create a unique piece of art for that. You can find something that's appropriate, or kit bash something together with, you know, a bunch of different images. Just make sure it's appropriate for your game. And the same thing is true for your font. So we're going to import fonts into Unity to use with TextMesh Pro. And in order to do that, we need .ttf fonts. Okay? Now, I've given you 2 as an example that you can use, right? You have access to all of this stuff, but I would like you guys to find your own font to use for this game, and it has to be a TTF file format. Now, the best place to find fonts, well, one of the best, you can find them all over the place, right? Just search on the web. But dafont.com, probably one of the better ways to find a font. You know, I could find something I like. Wow, I like this crash bow thing right here. Also, just make sure that it's listed as being free for personal use. I don't know that all of them are on this website, but just make sure that it's not a font you have to pay for, okay? So you're supposed to use ones that are free for personal use. You can open it up and download, and usually they'll give it to you in a couple file formats. They gave it to me just in a little zip here, and here I have TTF and OTF font types. And we're not going to install these into Windows. We're going to actually bring these files into Unity. So if I wanted to use this crash bow one, for example, you know, I'll save it here in my fonts folder, and then later when we're actually going to use it, we'll just drag that as an asset into Unity like we do with sprites and everything else. Normally you would double click these and install them into Windows if you want to use them in like Photoshop or something, but for these purposes, Unity will just recognize them as an asset, basically. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So anyway, those are the assets that you need for this leg of the assignment. Again, you can use my placeholder ones for now, but you will need your own versions of all of these. So let's open up the Unity project and just start working on the gameplay HUD. Okay, so we got our project open where we left off last time. We have all our sound effects and stuff implemented. So let's bring in our UI assets here. So I've got my fonts and my HUD elements here. So if we take a look in my assets folder, I actually have a fonts folder here. So I'm just going to bring my font files over into there. Let them import. And you can see that just like everything else, they come in as a font. You can open them up, but you can't really preview them properly. but they should be fine. If for some reason something screws up for you, just restart Unity. But there shouldn't be a problem here, really. And lastly, I'm going to go into my 2D Assets UI folder, and I'm going to bring in my 3 UI assets into here. So my HUD background, main menu background, and my little life bar here. And you can see it will have brought them in as sprites, which is exactly what we want for UI because the canvas uses sprites. So we're just going to leave them as is. They should be good to go. So we've got our fonts and we've got our UI. Actually, well, no, I won't bother doing that. So one thing you can do in the project view, which is kind of cool, is you can shift or control click multiple things. So I can have my fonts and my UI assets both kind of open at the same time here, and I can see all the assets in there. So I'm just going to do that so that I can access it. And like I said, we are going to be using the canvas system in order to set up this UI. And if you guys remember, way back in one of the previous assignments, we actually added a canvas, and you can see it's huge here in our game, right? We talked about this a little bit before, but we added a canvas so that we can have our little debug text that's going to display. And obviously we are going to disable that debug text, and there's an option to disable it in the game manager before you guys submit your final version of the game. But we already have a canvas set up for our UI, and this is exactly what we need, this canvas object here. And we talked about it a little bit already, but I will go over it again. And whenever we create a canvas in Unity, it automatically creates this object called an event system. And this object must exist in the scene in order for you to use the UI, or you will not be able to click buttons and stuff like that. So I'm not really going to talk about what it is. I did talk about it briefly before, but it's just a way to tell the UI how you want it to handle input, essentially. And obviously we're going to need that because when we make our main menu and stuff like that, we are going to have buttons that we want to be clickable and all of that good stuff. So we need the event system, and we need our canvas. If for some reason you don't have a canvas, you can just right click or click the plus button up here, go to the UI menu and create a canvas, right? And we could have more than one canvas in the scene if we want. In fact, let's have this. I'm going to name my old canvas to my debug canvas, and we just won't even work in there. And I'm going to make a new canvas, which you can see is the same size here, and I'm going to name that my UI canvas. And we'll put all of our different UI elements into this canvas probably. I guess the other way we could do it is, how is it done in the finished version of the project? Oh, okay. I guess it's set up for us to create separate canvases for each of our different UI elements here. So let's do it that way. Okay, we'll do it that way, just to make sure we don't screw anything up here. So instead, I'm going to name this first canvas my HUD, and we'll make the other ones when the time comes. Now, we talked about this a little bit before, the canvas, right? It's a little bit weird because you're editing a 2D canvas object in what is, a 3D game, and for some reason the canvases show up huge here. So if you're switching back and forth between editing things in your game and editing the canvas, the easiest thing to do is just select something like the main player and mouse over the scene view and hit F. And then you could select like your HUD canvas, do the same thing. Or you can also double click to get that same behavior. It's probably faster. Just so that you can quickly swap between, editing your UI, which is huge in comparison to your game, and editing your actual game, because they are basically like two separate things. You're never going to be like doing the same thing on a canvas and in the game at the same time. They're kind of separate entities, but they both exist here in the hierarchy. And we talked a little bit about, what the canvas is. It's essentially just an area that's based on the size of your screen. So if I go to my game window, my game right now is actually set to free aspect. I'm going to change mine to 16 by 9 so that I can more reliably work on my canvas here. Because if you have it set to free aspect, watch what happens. So if I have my thing set to 16 by 9, I change the size of my screen, it changes the size of my canvas, but it stays that uniform 16 by 9 size, which is exactly what I want. And you can see that the elements that are on the canvas shrink and grow with it in the scene view. If I have this on free aspect, it's going to be really wonky. And I'm going to end up with a broken canvas where my UI elements are all falling off the screen and all kinds of weird stuff like that. So the first thing to do is go to your game window and make sure it's locked to 16 by 9, because we're going to design our UI to work for 16 by 9. We're not going to worry about scaling it and stuff like that. That is definitely a more complex topic for another time. But we are going to work in 16 by 9 and make sure, you know, we keep it there so that when you guys hand in your games, I can actually play them. Right? I can actually see your UI without having to, and it'll show up in your build, right? That's kind of the key here. So, got in here, we got our canvas, and we can just start working on it. But let's just talk just a little bit about what exactly, you know, we're going to talk about a little bit about each element. So when we're working in UI and in the canvas and stuff, we, instead of having a regular transform, we have this thing called a rect transform, and that does become very important later. It's not so important on the canvas itself. The canvas's size and scale is controlled based on the screen size, and it uses the canvas scaler component to decide that. There's multiple different types of canvases you can do. You can have a special one set up with a camera pointing at it to look exactly the way you want. You can have a world space canvas to actually have 3D objects on your UI. And the canvas scaler itself, you can set it to a constant pixel size, or probably what would be better for us would be to tell it to scale with the screen size and then give it a reference resolution of maybe 1280 by 720. Just to try to make sure that our UI will always be on screen. So we could make that change. It's not strictly necessary, but it's probably not a bad idea to make that change. The other thing about the rect transform that we'll kind of discover as we add elements to it, like if we look back at our debug canvas here and we go to something like our debug text, it allows us to do things like anchor our UI components to certain areas of the screen so that when the screen scales, it'll make sure to keep like an element, if we want it right in the corner or against the top of the screen, it'll make sure to keep it in that space. And here's the thing, just like audio, right? The UI system is very complicated, and I'm not going to be able to teach you about all of it, okay? I'm just going to try to teach you as much as I can, and you will be going over it again, because there's a lot to it, and of course, everybody plays on different resolutions these days. There's widescreen monitors and phones, and, you know, there's everything, right? 16 by 9, 16 by 10, and everything, you know, tons of other resolutions and stuff. So creating a UI for a finished game is much more complex than what we're going to ever be able to do on school games. Like even on your third year capstone, if you're able to get your UI to scale to different resolutions, you'll be among the few who have ever even done that. Because even with this canvas system, there's still a lot that needs to be done. And this canvas system didn't used to exist. We used to have to create our UI all in code using Unity's GUI code. And just having the canvas system and the options that it gives us, we still have to build a lot on top of it to actually build a functional UI for a full release game, just like the audio system, right? It is still a starting point, but it saves hundreds of hours of potential work that would be required before the canvas system existed. So it is worth learning because it will save you an insane amount of time. I guess the only other thing I should maybe draw your attention to here is that the canvas, similar to the sprites, they do have a sort order. And if you think about it, right, there are certain menus you're always going to want to sort above other menus. Not in our game, but imagine you were, you know, porting a game to PlayStation and you had to pop up a controller disconnection thing. Or there's always going to be cases where you want certain menus to pop up over top of others. So just kind of draw your attention to that. We're not really going to use it, but it is kind of important to consider. That's why it's a good idea to make separate canvases for all your different UI elements, which is what we're going to do here. Right, we have our HUD canvas. We'll make one for the main menu. We'll make one for the game over menu as well. Yeah, so I guess that's enough preamble. Let's just kind of start working with it, and I'll, you know, explain things as we go along here if it's kind of required. Okay, so actually, before we get started here, let's just disable our debug canvas. Because we don't want that to be part of our final game anyway, and let's just focus on, you know, the new canvases that we are going to create here. Okay, So let's add our first element to the canvas, and we can talk about anchor points and you know, how we're actually going to get this thing to situate itself on screen. So I'm going to right click my HUD. Also, my head's in the way. Dang it. Maybe move myself to the other side of the screen. So I'm going to right click my HUD. I'm going to go down to the UI menu here, not the UI toolkit menu, the UI menu, and I'm going to add an image. This is very similar to a sprite. So you can see I added an image. I'm going to name this my HUD background. And anything inside my canvas will draw with the canvas as long as that canvas is actually drawing when I play the game. So right now when I play the game, I would just end up with a square in the middle of my screen, right? That would always be there. So you can notice it's very similar to our sprite, right? We have a sprite component here that we can drag our HUD background into. And there's our HUD background. It's all messed up. That's fine though. We're going to fix that. And there are a couple things to note here, right? So the sprite renderer is on here, and you can see that, again, very similar to the canvas, this has a rect transform instead of a regular transform. Now, what we can do to fix the fact that our guy's all squashed here is there's a little checkbox here that says preserve aspect, right? So that will allow you to, you know, rescale your component, but it will always preserve the aspect ratio of your component within the box that you're scaling. Right, so that's probably a good idea. You can also try the set native size button to just get it up to, you know, whatever its native pixel resolution is. But that doesn't really matter too much. I'll click that just to kind of get it in the right spot. And you may notice that there's this little X in the center of the screen. That has to do with the rect transform. So the rect transform does work a little bit differently from other transforms in Unity. And you'll notice if I move this guy around, how it kind of works, right? So you can see that first of all, you do have to be selected on this rect tool over here when you're working with UI, but it should be automatically selected on there. It has all these nice features kind of similar to Photoshop where it shows you like how far are you from the center of the screen, how far are you from the center of the screen on both the horizontal and vertical axes. And if you take a look at those numbers, you'll notice that they are actually the same numbers in its X and Y position up there in the rect transform, right? Well, that's kind of interesting. It's working a little bit differently compared to what we're used to, right? We're used to editing things and telling things where we want them to be in world space. But the UI is a little bit different. Everything in the UI is relative to the canvas's space, and an element is actually, its position is actually relative to its anchor point. So that's what this little X is in the bottom corner of the screen. So you see if I go over here, I've now gone into the negative of the X because I'm past that center point of the anchor. So it's not just the center point of the screen, but right now I have the anchor point here set to 0.5, 0.5, and you can imagine that this is 0, this is 1, this is 0, this is 1, right? So as I move my anchor point, it will actually change these numbers, and we'll do that in a moment here. I just kind of wanted to show you how this works. Right now we're in the negative on the X and the Y, and now we're in the negative just on the Y compared to where that anchor point is, right? And what you might think to do is just say, well, you know, I want my bar up here, so you know, I'll get it centered and I'll get it up against the top of the screen. And you go to your game view and you say, hey, that looks good. So you start playing your game. Actually, we don't even need to play the game to show this off. Oh, I'm going to shut my audio off. Make sure you don't do that for whatever you submit, though. And you say, hey, this is working great, right? Everything's in the right position. This is awesome. But what happens when you switch the aspect ratio, right? I could go, hey, now I want to play in 16 by 10. Well, that still works because it's still 16 in the height, right? But what if I want to play in, you know, some weird resolution, like 4 by 3 or something, right? And we could test that by going into free aspect. And watch what happens, right, as I adjust that resolution. Well, all of a sudden, our UI is starting to fall off screen, right? Or now it's like in the middle of the screen. Maybe I was playing on some kind of, maybe I was playing vertically on a phone, right? Because our anchor point, and I'm going to set this back to 16 by 9 for now. Because, and now you can see it's actually even slipped off the screen because of all that moving around that I did in free aspect, right? Because even the size of the game window in 16 by 9, even if you just keep it in 16 by 9, the size of the game window is still affecting it. So just moving it into place is not good enough, basically, is what I'm trying to tell you here. Oh, I guess I need to stop the game from playing. Sorry. We also are going to need to adjust the anchor point. We need to tell this element where we want it to be anchored in relation to the canvas at all times, right? So if you click this little box here, you can see that there's a bunch of predefined anchor points, right? I'm going to anchor my HUD element here to the top center of my screen. And now you can see that my anchor point there has moved. And you can also anchor things and allow them to stretch in different directions. And you can see my X is actually split because it's going to allow it to stretch on the height, but not on the width. And you can actually drag these around yourself even and set up, you know, custom anchor spaces where it will only, you know, stretch within a certain space. But we're not really going to do that for this. We're just going to anchor our points in a correct position. And you can see that my X and Y position have changed because, again, those positions are relative to where that anchor point is, right? So if I moved my HUD, said it was all the way up to the top of the screen or something, you know, eventually I could get it to 0, 0, 0. But now that it's anchored to the top of the screen, I'm going to put it up there, and you can see, you know, it's got some kind of weird values in here for the X and Y. That's fine. It doesn't really matter, right? It's more about where is this anchored in relation to the canvas. And now, if I was to play my game and mess around with the aspect ratio, you can see that it sticks to the top of the screen. So this is very important, and I want you guys to pay attention to this when you're setting up your UI elements. It's really, it makes a big difference because as soon as you try to display it on a different size screen, you're going to be wondering where the heck did my UI go, basically. It happens all the time, and it's a pain. Honestly, it is a pain. But set those, you can at the very least set those anchor points. And remember, our canvas is set to use scale with screen size. That's an important piece of this. And we're using a reference resolution. We could probably actually have stuck with 800 by 600, but we'll leave it there for now. Okay, so now we actually have our HUD bar properly anchored to the top of our screen. So let's add our lives to the HUD. And I can kind of use this to show you a couple other ideas here. So I'm going to do this a little bit wrong here. So I'm going to right-click my HUD, I'm going to go to UI, and I'm going to create an image again, and I'm going to drag my HUD life into the image here, and I'm just going to, you know, drag that up to sit on my bar. Maybe I want to, you know, scale that down a little bit. And you should be following along. I just want to show you that the hierarchy is extremely important when it comes to UI. Because right now, you know, how is this thing set up, right? It's anchored to the center of the canvas. That's not going to work, right? We need to somehow anchor it to the HUD bar behind us, right? We could play the game, and it looks fine right now, but once, you know, if we started changing the screen size, actually, it seemed okay there. I really wanted to get 4:3. Let's go into free aspect, I guess. There we go. So if we were to change the aspect ratio, now you can see it has no relation to the center HUD bar, so it's totally messed up now. All right, go back to 16:9. But the parent-child relationship is very important in Unity, and so is the order of everything. So the other thing you might be thinking is like, oh, well, we need to adjust the Z position of this to make sure that it always draws above the HUD background, but that's actually not true. With the canvas, how it works is it's all based on that parent-child relationship, and it's all based on the order things appear in this list, right? From top to bottom, so descending order. So watch what happens if I moved. I should also change this to say life 1 or something. Watch what happens if I move that above my HUD background. Now I can't see it because it automatically orders these things. As long as it's below, whoops, didn't mean to do that. As long as it's below the HUD, it will draw on top of it, which is kind of nice that they did that for the canvas system. And the other thing I want to do is I want to just child it to the HUD background because I want it to be anchored to the center of that object, right? Not to the center of the canvas. Now it's anchored to the center of the HUD background. So now, if I went to look out in the game and changed it to free aspect here, now it should be hard or impossible to get it to slip out of that spot. Okay? So just make sure you're setting up these things correctly. And I'm going to add another 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to have 4 lives in total here. And we'll hook these up later to a script, right? We're just kind of building out our UI here. And I'm going to move each one over. And it looks like I'm going to need to scale them down, but I'll get them all into position here. And then I'll select all of them and scale them all together, just like that. You can also use the you could also use, you know, these up here to do this stuff, or the scale values up here and stuff. But okay, so now we have our little life UI figured out here, and we're going to add some more UI elements, and the ones that we're going to add now are going to be text ones. So let's add our time element. So I'm going to right click on my HUD background, and I'm going to go down to the UI dropdown, and this time I'm going to add a Text Mesh Pro component. Now this is what we're going to use with our font, obviously. So I'm going to create a Text Mesh Pro component, and I'm going to name it time. And right now it's just using some default font, but because we've added it parented to the HUD background, it is already anchored to our HUD background, so it should be fine. And you can see here's the text mesh component here. We looked at it a little bit before. And what we're going to need to do is convert our fonts to be able to work with Text Mesh Pro. Okay, so let's start by just saying, well, you know, I'm going to put 999 in my font box here, because my time is going to be displayed in that format. And I'm also going to scale my box. Sorry, not that. I'm going to hold Alt to scale it equally on each side here. And I'm going to change a couple other things just to get it to display the way that I want, right? So this is very similar to working with font, you know, anywhere else, basically. You can change the font size. You can set your font to be bold, italicized. You can choose to try to auto size it based on the size of whatever your text box is set to, and then you can choose a minimum and maximum size. These things are all important. Obviously, we're going to go over them, you know, more in other courses, but Text Mesh Pro is a really nice component, because if you think about when you're going to be shipping a game, right, you're probably going to be localizing the game, and Text Mesh Pro kind of simplifies a lot of that. Consoles like PlayStation and Xbox and Switch, they have minimum font sizes that you must hit, or they will not allow you to put your game on their platform. So Text Mesh Pro allows you to have dynamic font sizes with a minimum and maximum font size, and it allows you to do things like set up how you want the font to look, so that when you swap it with other fonts like, you know, kanji, katakana, like other non-romaji fonts for other languages, it will maintain everything that you've set up for it. So also, obviously, I know that has nothing to do with what we're doing in this course, but I just want you guys to kind of think about the fact that all of these things that we cover, we're just kind of scratching the surface to start with here. And there's a lot that you can build on top of these things to improve them. And when it actually comes to making a game and releasing a game, especially on multi-platform, where the console manufacturers will put your game through multiple rounds of certification, there is a lot more to making a game than just creating the game itself. Okay, that is just the beginning. It took us almost a year to one of the games that I worked on the porting for. Took us almost a year to get it shipped to all 3 consoles, because of little things like this, right? Constantly bug fixing, sending the game in for certification, getting it back from Sony or Microsoft or Nintendo to tell us what we still need to fix, right? There are so many little nuances to it that really have nothing to do with the actual game development portion of it. Like, your game is finished, and there is so much more work to do. But luckily, at least some of it is kind of simplified for us, and that's why some of these complex components like Text Mesh Pro and Canvas and stuff exist, is to try to make that process a little bit easier, and also to try to make your game look better and make, you know, just creating a UI easier in the first place. So anyway, I'm going to leave my font to a constant size, but I am going to put my font in the center of the text box, and I'm going to make sure that it justifies to the center vertically as well here. And the other thing that you should be aware of, it's not really going to matter for what we're doing here, but there are options for whether you want your text to wrap or overflow. So for example, if my text box was too small, to display this text, you can see that it actually wraps down to the next line, right? And it actually overflows, whoops, outside of the text box because of the way it's set up. I'm going to turn wrapping off. I'm going to disable wrapping so that even if my text box was too small, it would still just display, you know, this whatever font size I had set up there. Right, so disabled wrapping and overflow is turned on. Now, there are a lot of other settings for Text Mesh Pro. It's pretty awesome. You can add like outlines to the text and stuff like that because it's an actual material asset. But that's why we're going to have to convert our fonts over to what's called a Text Mesh Pro asset in order to actually use them. Right? If I tried to change my font right now, I do not see, you know, my Broxy, By Streets, or my Crashbow fonts because we haven't converted them over to these font assets yet. Right? I couldn't drag them in here. They just won't work. So I'm going to go to Window, Text Mesh Pro, Font Asset Creator. Okay, and all you have to do is select the font that you want to switch over. So I'm going to start with this Bronx By Streets one. And I'm just going to leave everything at default, and I'm going to tell it to generate me a font atlas. And once that's done, I'm going to save it. It'll ask me where I want it to be saved. I'm just going to save it in the fonts folder where that font is. And there we go. There's my font asset ready for use with Text Mesh Pro. And I'll do the same thing for my other two here. So generate a font atlas, save it out. And finally, for this Disparador one, generate and save. So now I can actually use these. Okay, so I'm going to change, you know, I'm going to try my different fonts and see what looks good here. So there's my 999. That looks okay. It's a little messy. I don't really like that one that much. I don't really like that one that much either, to be honest. Ah, that's a good one. But you can see it's much smaller because the actual font size of this font just happens to be smaller. So I'm going to increase my font size. But this might be a good, you know, case for using auto size, right? Like I was talking about. Imagine if these were two different fonts from two different languages, right? And one of them was smaller than the other one, right? I could set my max font size to like 100 or something. And then I could swap back and forth between those fonts. And because I'm using auto size, it fills them all into the box, even though, you know, if I had auto size off, they would all be different sizes at that same font size. So we could use auto size, or you can just set it depending on whatever font asset you put in there. That's up to you. Okay, so that's going over Text Mesh Pro, and we're going to create one more Text Mesh Pro piece here that's going to be for our score, which is going to sit over here. So let's do that. Right-click our HUD, go to UI, create Text Mesh Pro, rename this to Score, and move it into place over here. And I'm going to just set it to like, you know, a bunch of zeros to start. And for this one, you know, I'll use one of my fonts that I like. I'll try auto size this time. Maybe 100 as the max size. And justify it to the center, or no, to the left. And the center of the text box. And that way it will justify to the edge here. Right? What we could do is see what'll happen, like if we had a score of 1, and then if we had a score of 10, and it'll just keep building towards the right. So we could just make sure that it could fill that whole space potentially. And the code is going to come in here and change this number instantly. That's why we can leave it at 999 and 00000, right? Because our code will change it right away. So I'm just going to fill my whole thing up with 999 so that, you know, when I'm looking at my game here and I want to come in here and start moving stuff around and changing the aspect ratio and all of that stuff that we were doing before to make sure that everything kind of stays in place and it's all looking good, right? I know that everything is kind of good to go. And that's all the elements that I'm going to do for my... Oh, right. I also want to turn off wrapping on my score because I don't want it... If it goes outside this box, I don't want it to wrap vertically. Okay, so there's our little completed UI. Now we just have to actually hook it up to get it to work. So I am going to collapse my HUD, and I'm going to click in an empty space, and I'm going to create a new empty game object. And this is going to be for holding all my different canvases. So I'll just call this UI. And I'm going to reset its transform. And I'm going to drag my HUD inside. And on the top level object there, the one that I just created, I am going to add a script called my UI manager. And obviously, just like a lot of other stuff that we've done in this project, right, this little UI manager here is designed to, do all the code that's going to be required for updating the score and updating the time and updating those lives. Okay, so obviously we've got to drag some stuff in here. So first of all, main menu. Well, we don't have that yet. End menu, we don't have that yet, but we do have our game HUD. So let's drag that in there. Now let's see, what else do we need? We have a list of lives images. Well, we have those, right, in our HUD. So let's lock the inspector up here, little lock icon. Select all 4 of my HUD images and drag them over the nameplate. And there we go. We got life 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sure they're in order. That's important. And now I'm going to unlock my inspector before I forget. What else? Time text, score text, health text. Well, we don't have health text, but we do have time text and score text. And if you would like to set up another text element for your health, you can, and it should work. I'm just not going to bother doing it because we've already done 2, but you can certainly do that, and it should work if your player has more than 1 health. The rest of these are for a bunch of stuff that we're going to be doing for our game over menu. We're going to come back here and add some stuff from our game over canvas that we will create, of course. And we have some settings down here for the fade out time for the HUD. We're just going to leave this stuff the way it is, but you can try adjusting these later once we have all the HUD elements in. So with that stuff set, we should be able, I'm going to save my scene because I haven't saved it for a while, I feel like. Save my project too because I don't want to lose any of this. With all that set, let's test our game and see if it works. And there we go. We can see right away that the script changed our values here. We have a score of 0 and 2 seconds have elapsed. All right? And we have 3 lives because in our, where is that set again? I guess it's probably set on our player. Yeah, so our main player has hit points and let's have lives somewhere, right? Ah, num starting lives. Okay, so I don't think you can go over 4 because we only have 4 images. It may still work, but it wouldn't display it. But because I started with 3 lives, it actually got rid of one of my images already. Right, and as I lose lives, it would lose those. Oh, sorry, gotta go back to 16:9. Oh no, I screwed up everything now. Oh, wait a minute, it's because the game's it's because the game was playing and I had it in free aspect like a dum-dum. Okay, let's try that again. Right, but it does all appear to be working. Let's make sure that we can, lose our lives and all that fun stuff. Right, and we're actually going to hook up a game over, of course. And as we shoot stuff here, actually, you know what? I don't think we're going to build up any score yet because I don't think we actually set any score information on any of our enemies and stuff like that. But we are elapsing time, and if I was to die, well, I guess that doesn't work yet either. Now, before we set up score stuff, I'm sure you guys noticed that in this UI manager, there is the HUD fade time. I just talked about it. So I'm going to go to my HUD canvas, and I'm going to add a component called the canvas group. And what that will allow us to do is adjust the actual alpha of the canvas. So it'll allow that script to work. Without that, your HUD will just pop on screen immediately as soon as you leave the main menu. If we have that canvas group added to our HUD, we save our scene, and we have our HUD fade time set to something more than 0, when we actually start in, the HUD will fade in from 0 up to 1 over 1 second, just like that. Okay, and that's exactly how we want it to work. So finally, here we'll deal with the lives not working when we are talking about the game over stuff. But the last thing we can do is go to our prefabs enemies folder, and all of our enemies in their respective scripts have a score amount. So for my boss, maybe I want to do a score of like 100. And for my boss turret, maybe I want to do a score of like 10. Meteorite could be a score of 5. Simple enemy could be a score of 7. Spiral enemy could be a score of 10. And my regular turrets could be a score of 10 as well. Or whatever you want, right? You can set whatever the heck you want for these values, obviously. And now, when I play my game, my HUD should fade in. And I should be able to build up score by killing enemies. And like I said, we'll deal with the lives. So there's 7 points for killing that guy. 14. Kill a turret. There's 24. Nice. All right, so now we can build up score as we play. Okay, guys, so I'm going to cut this video here, and in the next one, we will work on the main menu, which is going to be fairly simple, and then we'll do our game over, which is going to include tracking our player lives and a bunch of other stuff that we're going to do for the game over screen. And of course, we're going to add them as new canvases along with our HUD canvas that we just created here. Okay, guys, so I'll see you in the next video.